And we'll go through this together, and if you have questions, make sure you ask. But depending on how you like to study and keep track of information, sometimes it's easier on this table to remember the point in the cardiac cycle to figure out the next 3 columns. And some people really like to look at the point in the EKG, and then they work their way backwards. Okay, so that's why we're doing both. I'm not going to ask you a lot of questions about EKGs because I think if you're interested in it, you're going to go to grad school for exercise science. And then when you're in grad school for exercise science, you're going to do an internship and you're going to do like 1,000 hours of EKG. But if you're not interested in it, it can get really fuzzy really quick because there's a lot of things that can go wrong with EKGs and everything just for diagnostic tools. So the point of this is to be familiar with the basic EKG, and then to use that information to figure out what point we are at in the cardiac cycle. Okay? So when we're talking about things like P-wave, QRS complex, T-wave, TR segment, and ST segment, all we're talking about is an EKG. And an EKG, if it looks really clean and nice, it's going to look something like this. Anybody see these before? Okay. Anybody have one done? Yeah, a couple. And there's a couple reasons we might have an EKG done. We might have an EKG done because they suspect a problem. There was a point in COVID where if an athlete at St. Ben's got COVID, they had to go get an EKG done before they could return to play because they were afraid that we would get myocardial tissue growth that could eventually lead to a heart attack in an athlete, and make sure that we clear and dot our T's and or dot our I's and cross our T's with our athletes. But really what it does is tell us about the electrical current that's going on in the heart. Okay, so every time our SA node sent a signal, remember SA node? Where is our SA node located? Right atrium. Okay, when my person, I right atrium right here at an SA node. And that SA node would trigger contraction. And when we get contraction, we saw that rapid change in charge, right? We were a negative resting membrane potential. And then in order to get contraction, we changed to a positive membrane potential. And basically what an EKG does is it's going to put 3 to 12 electrodes on you, and it's going to measure the charge. We put an electrode here, we can put an electrode here, and then sometimes we put an electrode here, or we might put 4. Okay? And all these electrodes are doing is they're looking at the overall charge that's going on in the tissue. And from that charge, it's saying the charge is moving towards an electrode or moving away. Okay? So if we say this is baseline, and baseline is 0 here, right? we can look at that and see where is there deviation from zero. Okay? So we see that there's a positive deviation when we're looking at the P wave. It went away from zero in the positive direction. We see a little negative deviation at our Q, went below baseline, up, down, and all we're looking at is where is it positive and where is it negative compared to the rest of the cycle. And from that, we can tell if our heart is operating in a normal type fashion. Okay? And most of us, our heart is located under the sternum and it's orientated slightly to the left. Okay? So most of our EKGs would have a positive P wave, negative Q, positive R, negative S, and positive T. And really what that's saying is if the SA node polarizes, we're going to get positive charges that are going to go this way across that apex of the heart. Right? You see that contraction and that positive charge goes through the gap junctions to the other muscle tissue of the heart. And that registers by saying at this point before it was zero, and then we got a contraction, which caused the cells to change from negative to positive. And so we're going to get a positive pump. Okay? And then we can look at it from what's happening as it starts to go down. Well, we start to see some of this positive sit here when it hits the AV node. And at the AV node, we said there was a slight delay, right? Where we're letting that atria finish contracting. And so this is representative of the AV node delay. There's no contraction going on in that moment. If there's no contraction, it's returning back to baseline. Okay? And then as ventricular contraction starts to happen, you start to see positive charge go down and away, and then it comes back up. Okay? And that's how we get this QRS complex, because we're getting this movement of positive charge down and away from that electrode, and then it comes back up, which is why we get a positive and a negative at a QRS. And then the T wave is when our ventricular cells all return back to rest. Okay, we reset. So when we talk about the P wave, you should think about atrial contraction. When we talk about the QRS complex, you're going to think about ventricular contraction. And then when we talk about the T wave, you're going to think about ventricular repolarization. So where it's resetting to get back to resting conditions. Why don't you think that we see atrial repolarization in this? We see two depolarizations or two contractions, and we see one repolarization. Why don't we see atrial polarization? What has more muscle mass, the ventricles or the atria? Ventricles, okay? So if the ventricles are contracting, what's the atria probably doing? Relaxing, okay? And we just said the ventricles have a bigger muscle mass. So where do you think atrial repolarization is happening? In the P wave is atrial contraction, okay? And then QRS is ventricular contraction. Yeah, so we start to see atrial repolarization in this QRS complex, but because the ventricles are so big, most of the positive charge that we're reading is the QRS complex. Because the atrias don't really have a lot of muscle mass because they use gravity to move the blood downward, and they use a little bit of contraction, so they don't have a little bit of muscle mass. But the ventricles on the other side have a lot of muscle mass. So when we're just reading the overall charge difference between those, we don't see atrial repolarization because the muscle mass is so small. So its little change of positive to negative is so small in comparison to the ventricles contracting. There's a lot more muscle mass there, so the charge difference is bigger. The PR segment, this is where we have AV node delay. So we can make this AV node delay longer or shorter, depending on if we're getting more parasympathetic stimulation or less parasympathetic stimulation. Which one's going to make AV node delay longer, sympathetic stimulation or parasympathetic? An idea? No? How got an idea? Yeah, the more parasympathetic stimulation we have, the longer this gets. So when you guys are sitting here in class, your PR segment should be pretty long because we have a lower heart rate. As you get up and get moving, this gets shorter because we're getting more sympathetic stimulation, and if it gets shorter, we're going to have a faster heartbeat. Right? The distance from the start of the P wave to the start of the P wave, that's one heartbeat. Right? So the shorter that distance becomes, the faster our heart rate goes. Most of the time, we'll measure it R to R, like point to point, because not everybody has a P wave. But everybody who's living has a ventricular contraction. So the shorter that distance gets, the less time it's taking, so the faster the heart rate is going. And then that ST statement is another reset, but we look at the ST statement to determine whether or not somebody's having a heart attack. So we can start to see a rise or a fall in that. And then, so it's like clinically significant, but it's not significant in the time that we're talking about, except for it's going to be occurring during that isovolumetric relaxation. Okay? Anybody know what tachycardia is? Yeah, so we said the SA node has a normal range between what and what? 60 and 100. So if you're above 100, we would say you're in tachycardia. So if you're sitting here at rest and you take your heart rate and you're like, oh, I'm at 112, we would say you're in tachycardia. Your heart's beating faster than we would expect your SA node to fire. Okay? On the other side of that, we have bradycardia. What's that one? Yeah, it's going too slow. So what would we say that's probably going to be in terms of heart rate? Lower than 60 beats per minute. Okay. In and of itself, neither one's a problem, but they could be an indication of a problem for some people, right? I bet a lot of you have a heart rate, if you're not caffeinated and you slept well, have a heart rate less than 60 at rest because you're fit, young adults, right? Body stature can influence this. If I'm 5'1" and I don't have to move a lot of blood through my body because I just have a smaller stature, I probably have a lower heart rate. Opposed to if I'm a 6'4" guy who's like a ton of muscle mass, I got to move a lot more blood through to meet the energy needs of my body. they might have a slightly higher heart rate. Now, if we see somebody who's fairly inactive, carrying a lot of excess body fat around and is struggling with breathing, all of a sudden bradycardia or tachycardia become a little bit more significant to us. So in and of themselves, not a big deal, but we use them as rule outs. Okay? And then arrhythmia. An irregular heartbeat. So if somebody doesn't have a P wave, we would say they have an arrhythmia. Or if a P wave doesn't lead to a QRS complex. We get a P wave, a P wave, a P wave, a P wave, QRS complex. We say that's arrhythmia. There might be a blockage in there. If you don't get a T wave every time, we would say that that's an arrhythmia. So something that looks different than that picture is going to be an arrhythmia. All right. Review of last 2 weeks ago. Diastole is when the heart is relaxing or contracting. Relaxing. Okay. Systole is contraction. Anybody come across isovolumetric contraction? ISO means, who's my basketball players in the room? Anybody ever run an ISO play? Maria, help me with this. ISO meaning one, isolate, right? We're gonna isolate something, okay? Volumetric, so like a one volume, so we're getting a non-changing volume and contraction, okay? So this is where all of our valves are closed. So we have 4 valves to our heart. If all those valves are closed, we're not gonna get a change in the volume, but we could get a change in the pressure. Okay, so this happens when all our valves are closed. Stroke volume. Yeah, how much blood is pumped up? So let's say after diastolic filling, so like our ventricles are filling with blood, we have 140 ml of blood in our ventricle. And then let's say our ventricles contract, and when we end contraction, there's 70 milliliters of blood left in the ventricle. How much blood was pushed out? 70, okay? So we had a stroke volume of 70 milliliters, okay? So end systolic and diastolic volume minus end systolic volume is going to equal stroke volume. How much did we start with in our ventricle? How much did we end in our ventricle? Leads to how much blood our body actually got each time our heart beat. Cardiac output. What? Is stroke volume and rhythm? Stroke volume times heart rate. And this is measured per minute. Okay, so if our stroke volume goes up, what can happen to our heart rate? Stroke volume increases, what would happen to heart rate? Decrease, right? And if our heart rate goes up, what's probably happening to our stroke volume? Going down. Okay. So this comes back to like, I think it was Addison, when we were measuring heart rates before. Yeah. You had like a heart rate of like 3, I mean like 54. Yeah. Okay, so if Addison has a heart rate of 54, and let's say Addison and I are the same stature, and I have a heart rate of 90, who probably has a bigger stroke volume? Addison has a 50 heart rate, I have a 90 heart rate. We're just sitting around. Who probably has a bigger stroke volume? Addison does, right? And this just leads us to like basic math. So if we need X blood flow and blood flow equals cardiac output, and that equals stroke volume times heart rate. Right, so my body to exist needs so much blood. So that means I need so much cardiac output, which means I need to have these two multiplied to equal my cardiac output. Okay? And if Addison and I have the same stature, so I also need X blood flow. And let's say Addison has a heart rate of 50, and I have a heart rate of 100. What can we determine about our stroke volume? We're both adding up to X. I know, I'm turning the math class, Kelly. How much larger is my heart rate than Addison's? What? It's twice as big. Right, so what probably is my stroke volume compared to Addison's? Half of it, right? And so we're both getting our cardiac needs met, but Addison is doing it way more efficiently than I am. Because every beat that our heart takes energy. So I'm using twice as much energy to meet my energy demand of my body compared to Addison. So this is why when we talk about cardiac fitness, it is good to have low blood pressure. It is good to have a large stroke volume. It is good to make sure that we can have a low resting heart rate, because that means our body, our heart has to work less hard. And if you only have 1 million beats in your life, it would be good to extend how long those beats take. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So that's indirectly how we can use heart rate and blood pressure to tell us how fit you are. If your blood pressure is 150 over 90 and Don's is 100 over 60, Don's heart has to work way less hard than mine, which means his heart has to beat less forcefully, which means it takes less energy, which means your heart's not going to wear out. All right, and then the other piece that we look at is what's called the ejection fraction. So the ejection fraction is how much did we have compared to how much did we pump out. So in this case, this person had an ejection fraction of what? $70 is what compared to 140? Half, okay? So this person, if they started with 140, they ended with 70, they have an ejection fraction of 50. If somebody had, oh boy, let's say they had a filling of 150 and they ejected 100 milliliters, they would have an ejection fraction of 66%, 1/3, right? the higher your ejection fraction is, the better and more efficiently your heart is working. Okay, so we say that an ejection fraction above 65 is good. Your heart is working. You're never going to have a 100% ejection fraction. We're not that efficient. But a 65% ejection fraction is really good. We worry if your ejection fraction is lower than 35. In fact, if your ejection fraction is above 35 and you need heart things, sometimes Medicare won't cover it because they'll say your heart isn't working too well. But as soon as you drop below that 35% ejection fraction, Medicare is like, oh yeah, fix them. Okay. In cardiac rehab, I've seen people with ejection fractions of 10, which means for every 100 milliliters they're getting into their heart, they're only pumping out 10 milliliters. How fast do you think their heart rate is? It's real high. They're usually in like the 150s. Just sitting down. Okay? They're usually on oxygen, they're usually got walkers, and we're wheelchairing them into place. So ejection fraction is one way that we can figure out how effectively your heart is working. Okay? Questions on vocabulary stuff? We'll review it, we'll go over it over and over again. Got a new black marker. Okay. All right, so the last thing we got to talk about for heart is when are our valves opened or closed? Because when our valves are open and closed determines where our blood is flowing. Okay. And whether or not our heart's valves are open or closed depends completely 100% based on pressure. So if this is my heart from over top, so the top view looking down, we have our tricuspid, our bicuspid, our aortic, and our pulmonary. Okay. And we said that if the tricuspid valve is open, what other valve is going to be open? Shake your brains open. Tricuspid connects what to what? Right atrium to right ventricle. So this is an atrium to a ventricle. What other valve connects an atrium to a ventricle? Bicuspid. Right? So if the tricuspid valve is open, the bicuspid valve is open. Okay? And the pulmonary valve connects the ventricle to what? The pulmonary circuit. So this connects it to a circuit. Okay? And the aortic connects the ventricle to a circuit. So if the pulmonary valve is open, the aortic valve is open. Right, so these two work in tangent. Whatever this one is also going to be. And whatever the tricuspid valve is doing, our bicuspid valve is doing as well. Okay? Because we said our heart works in rhythm, right? The top is open and contracting, then the bottom is relaxing. Okay? Left and right. And whether or not these valves are open or closed depends on the pressure related to it. So if atrial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, our tricuspid and bicuspid are open. Okay. if our ventricular pressure is greater than atrial pressure, tricuspid and bicuspid are closed. Now the same thing happens for ventricular pressure. If ventricle pressure is greater than the pressure in the pulmonary circuit or the systemic circuit, then these valves are going to open up. Kind of like if we push a door, right? The harder I push on the door, has anybody tried to get into Sexton? And those doors weigh like 1,000 pounds, and then you go on to St. Ben's and you use the same amount of force and you're afraid you're going to throw the door open, like pull it literally off of its hinges. Okay, so if I go to Sexton and I try and push the door and I only use a little bit of force, is the door going to open? No, the door stays closed. Okay, as soon as I create more force than the door opens. That's the same way valves work. If you create enough force where the force on one side is greater than the force on the other, we're going to get a valve that opens. If you don't create enough force, that valve stays closed. Okay? So if we're talking about the ventricle relaxing, anytime you hear relaxing, what should we think about pressure? High or low? Relaxing. What if we think about lifting dumbbells? If my muscle is relaxed, am I going to do a lot of lifting force? Am I creating a lot of pressure then? No, right? So if I see diastole, I immediately think low pressure or whatever comes behind it. Okay? So if we have low ventricular pressure, the opposite is going to be true for the atria, right? So here we're going to have high atrial, or is greater than ventricular. Now, if atrial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, which two valves did you say are going to be open? Tricuspid, bicuspid. Okay. And if our tricuspid and bicuspid valves are open, which way is the blood going to flow? What do these connect? Atria and ventricle. So we're going to see blood going from the atria to the ventricles. Okay. Late ventricular diastole. We're still in diastole. It's still ventricular relaxation, but we still have atrial pressure greater than ventricular pressure. So our tricuspid and bicuspid are still open. So we're still getting blood flow coming from the atria to the ventricles. Okay. Okay. Now the difference in this is right here, we're going to see kind of a straight line or our baseline on the EKG. Because our atria hasn't started contracting yet. So in this early to mid ventricular diastole, we're looking at this time segment right here, right? Our atria haven't contracted yet. And so we're just kind of in this baseline waiting for atrial contraction. And then all of a sudden we get to late ventricular diastole. And what do the atria start to do during that? Are they still relaxing or are they going to start contracting? If this is in diastole, what's the other one probably in? Systole. Systole means contraction. And when we're in contraction, we're going to get a movement from baseline. So this is when we hit the P wave. Same thing is happening here. We're at the end of ventricular diastole. So we still have an atrial pressure, still greater than ventricular pressure. And this allows that last forceful pumping of blood into our ventricles. Okay? So our tricuspid and bicuspid are still open. And we're still getting blood flow from the atria to the ventricles. Now, all of a sudden, our ventricles hit systole. And as our ventricles hit systole, what's happening to ventricular contraction? Increasing or decreasing? Systole means contraction or relaxation? Contraction, okay? So imagine that I blew a balloon up, and then I tied it in a knot, and then I squeezed it. Where does all the air go? To the top, right? So as this is happening, we would say, what would be the pressure happening in that balloon as I squeezed it? Would it be increasing or decreasing? It'd be increasing, okay? So as we get to systole, we're going to see atrial pressure become less than ventricle pressure. So what do you think is going to happen to those tricuspid and bicuspid valves? They're going to stay open or are they going to close? They're going to close. Now, so these two close because atrial pressure is really low. Atrial pressure is almost zero. Is systemic pressure almost zero? No, systemic pressure is pretty high. So at this point in time, we have no valves open. Because atrial pressure is less than ventricular pressure, and ventricular pressure is less than circulatory pressure. So what's happening to the blood at this point in time? Are we getting any blood flow anywhere? Mary's shaking her head at me, no. Why is there no blood flow? There's no valves open. It'd be like having you guys in this room, blocking the doors and being like, get out. Just can't happen. There's no way to get out. So we have no blood flow during this time. And this is the start of our QRS complex. And during this time, we're starting to see an increase in ventricular pressure, but depending on what your blood pressure is, your valves may or may not open. So even though this is increasing and it's still greater than atrial pressure, depending on what your blood pressure is, your ventricular pressure may still be less than your circulatory pressure. So if you have a really low blood pressure, your heart's going to reach where this flips sooner than if somebody has a really high blood pressure. Okay? So again, we have no blood valves working, no blood valves open, no blood flow. and this is QRS. Why is our QRS complex so big? Because we're trying to generate enough force to open those valves up. And all of a sudden, we've generated enough force where ventricular pressure has increased enough to be greater than circulatory pressure. And when that happens, what valves are going to open up? What? Your pulmonary and your aortic. Okay, so blood is going to be flowing from our ventricles to our circulatory. And this is the end of the QRS complex. Now, immediately after we reach greater pressure and we push blood out, we start to go into relaxation. And if we're relaxing, we're generating less pressure, and all of a sudden, ventricular pressure becomes less than circulatory pressure, and ventricular pressure is still greater than atrial pressure. And if we see this, where ventricular pressure is less than circulatory pressure, that means these valves are going to do what? Open or close? They're going to close. And if ventricular pressure is still greater than atrial pressure, what's happening at the tricuspid and bicuspid level? They're also closed. So we have another point in time where we have no valves open because our pressure won't allow, nothing greater than the other one. And so again, we have no blood flow. And this is going to be during that ST and T wave. Now, as we go into that relaxation period of time, we're going to get ventricular pressure is decreasing, but it's still slightly greater than atrial pressure. So we have no valves open. No blood flow. And this is the T wave. And then from here, you just pull back up to the top. And this cycle just continually repeats itself every time your heart takes a beat. A valve is open, which allows blood to go through. The valve closes when pressure gets lower than something moving next to it. And this is how we see our heart. Yeah. Okay, that's it for today. Oh, test. You want those, right?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask.
If you took a paper copy of your test, I got it. All right. Isabella.
Yeah, so it's 3 weeks before. there's a light. Yeah.
Chapter is active here. Or John. Yeah, I'll email yours back to you because they emailed it back to me.
Thank you.